Hello once again everyone, and welcome back. It's finally time for another guide, hopefully better late than never. Expedition brought with it some truly devastating changes. Builds that can perform well at every budget level have never been in higher demand. So this time around I'll be covering the Forbidden Rite Totem Hierophant. Unleash the devastating power of this brand new spell that derives its strength from consuming the caster's life. A burden that is better placed on our totems instead of us. There the downside can be easily mitigated, and we can leverage the totem's massive life pool to deal incredible damage. With some investment into cast and projectile speed, our totems will be hurling countless, fast-moving, exploding projectiles at everything nearby, resulting in surprisingly smooth and flexible clear speed. Projectiles that we directly add to Forbidden Rite will be fired with every cast, even at single targets, nuking just about every boss to the ground in no time. The playstyle in practice is easy to understand and to execute. Though totems may not be for everyone, they handle the heavy lifting, while you place new totems and generally focus on staying alive. The build also has incredible consistency. It is completely curse immune, can run any map modifier out there, and has a low reliance on buffs and flasks for damage output. Defensively, the build is solid, but isn't going to win any awards. For most players, this should be enough, but additional defensive options will be discussed throughout the video. Getting the build going can be done on an incredibly small budget. All you'll need is a couple exceptionally affordable uniques. Moderate investment into a 6-link, flexible rares, and a few key items should allow you to take down most of the endgame. And if you want to continue investing, the build has a ridiculously high damage ceiling. As a league starter, this is an easy recommendation. Just keep in mind that specific items like Vierdy's Veil will be in very high demand early league, and take time to normalize in price. For both hardcore and solo self-found, Forbidden Rite Totems is seeing some serious popularity. While easy to recommend, please keep in mind that this guide is focused on softcore trade, and will need meaningful adjustments for other modes. If you'd like to rain destruction down upon Rayclast, stick around as I break down how to make it happen. This guide uses the Path of Building community fork, known as POB, to summarize its key information. Copy in the pastebin link found below for access to a thorough library of gem setups, gear sets, and skill trees for every investment level. I'll be updating the POB link for each new league. It's worth noting that Forbidden Rite will be getting nerfed next league. The good news is that the build currently does absurd levels of damage. Even if it receives a significant nerf, it will likely still do fantastic damage. So let's get started with the core mechanics. Forbidden Rite is a chaos spell that fires a single exploding projectile near the targeted location. Any projectiles we manually add to the spell will also be fired at that location. Each projectile deals damage independently and can shotgun. However, adding additional projectiles increases the overall spread, meaning there's a limit to the amount of projectiles that can reliably hit a single target. Firegrass did some great testing on the projectile behavior. Thanks to his research, the sweet spot seems to be around 4 manually added projectiles, for a total of 5. Adding even more projectiles isn't bad, but will only be effective against very large targets. If there happen to be additional enemies near the target, Forbidden Rite will automatically fire single extra projectiles at those enemies, enabling the skill to be powerful at both clearing and bossing. When Forbidden Rite is cast, it deals a massive amount of chaos damage to the user. In return, it scales its base chaos damage off of the user's maximum life and energy shield. Spell totems can reach up towards 20,000 maximum life, causing Forbidden Rite to deal much more damage than a player could ever hope to achieve themselves. Spell totems in many ways are replicas of the player, borrowing many of the player's stats. As a result, the build is largely scaled using regular modifiers. However, totems have a separate life pool, effectively have no mana concerns, deal less damage, and have less cast speed, and take less damage as well. We'll be utilizing the Cluster Jewel notable Ancestral Preservation, so our totems can cast Forbidden Rite many more times before dying. This build will typically cap out at 5 totems, each rapidly casting Forbidden Rite simultaneously. Our spell totem support is provided directly by the Soul Mantle. This allows us to run a powerful 7-link setup, but in return, a random hex is inflicted on us, the player, anytime a totem dies. This is a massive downside that must be worked around. This is initially accomplished by reducing the effect of curses on the player by 100%. We can get 40% from the Ring Kikuzaru, 20% from each of these clusters, and another 20% from the fully upgraded Soul of Yugel. Any combination of these that adds up to 100% will be effective. Eventually you'll want to upgrade to Vierdy's Veil, which will make you completely hexproof with a magic ring in the right ring slot, a far more elegant way to accomplish the same goal. With the most important basics covered, let's talk about our Ascendancy. We'll first be taking Pursuit of Faith. which heavily improves the totem playstyle by allowing us to place long-lasting totems almost instantly. But most importantly, it increases the maximum number of totems we can have summoned at one time, a massive increase to our damage output. Second, we'll be taking Ritual of Awakening, which scales based upon the amount of totems we have active. With our max of 5 forbidden Rite Totems and 2 additional Wither Totems, we can have 7 active at once. This results in a ridiculous 35% more damage and a significantly improved life and mana sustain. Third, we'll be taking Conviction of Power, which increases our maximum power and endurance charges to 4, and increases our minimum number of both charges to 4 as well. In practice, this simply means we'll always have 4 of each. They can't be consumed or lost and will always benefit us. Last and certainly least, pick up Divine Guidance, which improves the effectiveness of our Mind Over Matter to 40%, allowing more of our unreserved mana to act as effective life. It also increases our maximum mana, and weaponizes all of our increases to maximum mana at 30% of their original value, a small but meaningful damage boost. Now let's take a look at the build skill tree progression, general investments, and jewels used. In the early endgame, you'll be running a flexible tree that looks something like this. These 2 curse effect clusters are flexible and will vary depending on your setup, before progressing into your first cluster jewel, followed by a full cluster setup, and eventually 2 full cluster setups. If you can afford the expensive Coward's Legacy, here are additional high investment skill trees that feature the powerful keystone Pain Attunement. Across all of our skill trees, we'll be running these 2 keystones. The totem-focused Ancestral Bond prevents us from dealing damage ourselves, but allows us to summon another maximum totem, increasing our damage output dramatically. The previously mentioned Mind Over Matter allows us to use our unreserved mana as effective life. With the recommended level of investment, 40% of damage will be taken from mana before life, meaning you'll want to have a 67% mana to life ratio in order to maximize your effective life pool. Basically, this means if you have 3,000 life, you'll want 2,000 unreserved mana. This can be really easy to forget as your tree and gear progress. I even did so myself right before recording. Simply dropping a mana cluster or 2 was enough to set me far below what I needed. Do your best to keep this ratio in mind as you develop the build. Regardless of your skill tree, jewels play a huge role in the build's performance. The cheap Self-Flagellation is the perfect complement for Soul Mantle, increasing our damage output for every curse that is currently applied to us, up to a max of 9. Prioritize getting a relatively high roll, but don't break the bank. You can always upgrade later. The same goes for the cheap Rain of Splinters, which slightly lowers our totem damage, but in return allows our totems to fire 2 additional projectiles. Because Forbidden Rite can shotgun, this multiplies our damage output considerably, and is one of our single biggest damage increases. Make sure this is one of your earliest upgrades. Totem-focused medium cluster jewels are crucial to the build's performance. Getting at least 1 copy of the notable Ancestral Preservation is necessary to ensure our totems can survive repeated casting. Try to secure this notable right away, even if the jewel isn't perfect. A more optimized jewel should have 5 passives or less, and should feature Ancestral Preservation alongside one of these other notables, the best of which is Sleepless Sentries for nearly constant onslaught. As you work towards a full cluster setup, you'll need a large chaos damage cluster jewel, ideally with just 8 passives, and at least 2, but ideally 3 of these notables. For the other medium cluster, you can run another totem cluster with another copy of Ancestral Preservation. Alternatively, I recommend many players run a more affordable projectile damage medium cluster here instead, featuring the notable Shrieking Bolts, causing our totems to taunt enemies on projectile hit. This draws their attention away from us and serves as a powerful defensive layer. Alongside it, I recommend running Streamlined or Repeater. If you continue to invest, eventually you'll want to run a second full cluster setup. This will look very similar to the first, featuring a large chaos cluster and 2 medium clusters of your choice. Before we move on, a few more jewels to consider. The affordable Clear Mind is a really strong option, as long as you go with my core recommendation of not running any miscellaneous auras, leaving all of your mana unreserved. An expensive Watcher's Eye, featuring cast speed while affected by Zealotry, is a solid option all around. A cheap Spire of Stone in this socket provides a decent damage boost. This is fantastic early on, but should eventually be replaced with a solid rare or another alternative. An expensive Transcendent Flesh in this socket specifically, without any of these nodes allocated, will provide serious power, though I'm not recommending it directly. Any sockets you have left over should be occupied by rare jewels like these, featuring a flexible combination of the listed modifiers. Now let's discuss how to properly play the build. Here are the keybinds I used. Treat this as a baseline to be modified as you see fit. When leveling the build, I recommend using gem setups like these. When you switch to Forbidden Rite Totems is ultimately up to you. Switching directly into Soul Mantle and 2 Kikizaru rings at level 49 will be the smoothest. Here are the leveling uniques I recommend running, and some of the flasks you should consider using. Follow this progression of skill trees. Eventually transitioning into our initial endgame tree. As far as map modifiers go, the build can run just about anything. The only modifier that can prove troublesome is players cannot regenerate life, mana, or energy shield, but it is still doable with the help of a mana flask and utility skills like Vol Clarity. When selecting your Pantheons, be sure to capture every additional soul. Each of the major gods provide compelling benefits, but I recommend going with the Brine King. And for the minor god, before you secure Curse Immunity, you may want to capture Yugel's Extra Soul for the 20% reduced effect of curses. Once you have full Curse Immunity, consider one of these other options. For your bandit selection, I recommend either helping Alira or killing all of them. Alira provides a little bit of everything we need and will make the early gearing easier. Most players should start with her. General gameplay with this build is very simple. Try to stay consistently on the move, placing totems as you go along. Always put them in harm's way before yourself. Focus your energy on avoiding incoming damage, positioning your totems, and keeping your flasks up. If you're having trouble, try to increase your totem's cast and projectile speed so they can engage with targets faster. Against average bosses, all you'll typically have time to do is place your Forbidden Rite and Wither totems before flame dashing away. The fight should wrap up quickly on its own. For more substantial bosses, before they spawn in, you'll want to be rapidly placing totems, stacking up as many curses as possible. Place your 2 Wither totems as well, and ensure that all 7 totems are in good position. Place several Arcanist brands on the ground, right where the boss will spawn. One will attach to the boss and automatically cast Assassin's Mark just before or right as the boss activates. Flame Dash to proc Arcane Surge, pop your flasks, and activate Vol Righteous Fire or Vol Grace if you're running one of those. Try to immediately gain some distance. There's no reason to stand close to the boss. If your setup is good, even serious bosses shouldn't last long. If they heavily reposition or survive the initial barrage, continue to focus on avoiding damage while repositioning your Forbidden Rite and Wither totems for another burst. It's time to cover the bigger sections of the skill gems and the gear. Our Forbidden Rite 6th link will be socketed directly into our body armor, the Soul Mantle, automatically supporting it with level 20 Spell Totem, making it a powerful 7 link. Following the brutal gem changes that occurred this league, Void Manipulation, increased critical damage, and increased critical strikes are the strongest support gems available. Because we're only trying to reach 5 total projectiles, Volley is paradoxically the best way to make that happen. Unlike Greater Volley or GMP, it has virtually no damage penalty and can be combined with Rain of Splinters to achieve 5 projectiles with almost no downside. I heavily recommend going this route, but you can choose to run Greater Volley instead. This will result in more projectiles that are less impactful. Our final support gem is the most flexible. Faster casting is arguably the best overall. It offers a very competitive damage boost and allows our totems to fire much faster after being placed, which can be surprisingly beneficial defensively. Alternatively, Cruelty provides slightly more damage but doesn't do much else. Multiple totems is strong and convenient, but is ultimately less powerful than our other options, and using it here prevents us from running a Wither totem setup at all. If you're a complete lunatic or have way too much damage, faster projectiles will boost your clear speed and is quite strong defensively. When looking to optimize the setup, try to maximize the quality on Forbidden Rite first. Eventually look to upgrade to an Awakened Void Manipulation. Next we've got an impressive 1 link, the powerful Aura Zealotry, socketed into our ring the Essence Worm so it doesn't reserve any mana, leaving it all free for Mind Over Matter. Our 4-link debuff setup can be socketed flexibly. Wither is a channeling spell that hinders enemies, slowing their movement, while also inflicting the Wither debuff, which increases the chaos damage they take by 6%, a form of More multiplier that can be stacked up to 15 times, drastically increasing our damage output. We'll be automating Wither with Spell Totem, consistently building up far more stacks than if we were to cast it ourselves. Normally placing a Wither totem would cause one of our Forbidden Rite totems to go away, but with multiple totem support socketed here, our Wither totems can surpass the usual limit by 2, and can coexist alongside our Forbidden Rite totems. Round out the setup with faster casting or increased duration. They both make our Wither totems more effective. Our 4-link movement setup can be socketed flexibly. By keeping Arcane Surge at a low enough level, it will be triggered every time we Flame Dash, heavily increasing our spell damage and mana regen. Increased duration simply allows the buff to last longer, and of course, has the same effect on Vol Righteous Fire, a strong but ultimately optional Vol skill that dramatically improves our boss damage, but sacrifices a massive chunk of our life and energy shield on use, though this can be recovered quickly with the right Flasks. Alternatively, consider the defensively focused Vol Grace, or even expand the Flame Dash setup with Second Wind. Next, we've got a 4-link cast when damage taken setup, which can be socketed flexibly. It will automatically cast Phase Run and Immortal Call as we take damage. Ensure that each of your linked spells have a level requirement equal to or less than that of cast when damage taken itself, or they won't be triggered. I recommend running the setup at these low levels, so it triggers reliably. Immortal Call lowers the amount of elemental and physical damage we take for a short time. Increased duration simply makes it last longer. Phase Run increases our movement speed, makes us more difficult for enemies to detect, and even allows us to phase through enemies. Using any skill manually will cause the buff to end early. Alternatively, you could run Cold Snap for a somewhat consistent flow of frenzy charges. Alternatively, you could run a max level cast when damage taken and a max level steel skin, or even a max level steel skin that you can cast yourself by having it serve as your move only key. Next, we've got our 2-link curse setup, which should be socketed into your wand or shield. We'll be slightly automating the powerful Assassin's Mark with Arcanist Brand. This allows us to mark dangerous targets far easier. By simply placing the brand where the boss spawns, it will automatically attach and apply Assassin's Mark. In the final unlinked socket, you can run a defensively focused utility skill. Our final setup has room for 3 more gems, and should be placed into our wand or shield. Many players may want to make room for a shield charge 3-link, a somewhat awkward way to get the defensively powerful Fortify into the build. Other players may want to run these 3 low reservation auras. Others still may enjoy having room for a few of these optional utility skills. Now it's finally time to discuss the gear. These categories will be used to better estimate the future cost of the items discussed. So let's begin with the wand. Early on, you can run the cheap unique Apex Rage, which is strong enough to carry you for as long as necessary. Eventually upgrade to a flexible rare, featuring a strong combination of these relevant offensive modifiers. Some players may want to run 2 wands permanently, or at least early on, before power is secured elsewhere. Whether you're running a shield right away or securing it later, you'll be wanting a flexible rare like this, ideally featuring a balanced combination of these offensive and defensive modifiers. The most important and expensive being +1 to maximum totems, a massive boost to the build's overall playstyle and single target damage. Alternatively, the affordable Troll Timber Spire is incredibly strong defensively. Adding Leech to the build is no joke and will improve your sustain immensely. If you can sacrifice the damage, this is worth consideration. Next up, we've got our helmet. Early on, you can run a flexible rare or a cheap unique, but eventually, if you want to push the build's power level, you'll need a Viridi's Veil, which will be expensive early league, but will drop in price rapidly, eventually becoming cheap. With a magic rarity ring in the right ring slot, Viridi's Veil does 2 things. It makes the damage from enemies' hits unlucky. In practice, this means that we'll be taking less damage overall, a powerful defensive layer. The Veil's second component makes us hexproof, meaning that you can drop the rings, Pantheon, or skill tree clusters that you've been using so far. Soul Mantle will still work perfectly, making Viridi's Veil one of our best items and a very high priority upgrade. Eventually try to secure an enchanted Viridi's Veil. The strongest is undoubtedly the extra projectile, though this will also be the most expensive. Next, we have our body armor, which couldn't be anything but Soul Mantle. This item is beyond best in slot and is absolutely required. Fortunately, it's so common that for most players it should be very cheap to pick up. If you eat Exalted Orbs for breakfast, look for these corruptions. Now let's talk gloves. For most players, these will be by-the-book, flexible rares, mainly featuring life, mana, and resistances. Securing a high dexterity roll here will make your gearing a lot smoother. For our boots, I recommend the cheap Torch Oak Step. For other totem builds, these are pretty lackluster, but for us, 50% totem life is a huge damage increase, and the extra placement speed is pure convenience. Alternatively, you could instead run one of these uniques, and of course, you could just run a flexible rare. Once you've settled on some boots, you're going to want to enchant them, Since we, as the player, never kill directly, the 120% increased critical strike chance is always active. This makes a huge difference, and is well worth the time or currency investment. For our amulet, I recommend most players run a flexible rare. Though I recommend always securing life and critical strike multiplier here, everything else you choose to look for is going to depend on what your iteration of the build needs, whether that's attributes, resistances, or pure offensive power. Some players may want to consider alternatives. Itziri's Foible is fantastic if you want to invest more heavily into mana, and Xerfi's Heart allows our chaos damage to do powerful things it normally couldn't, while also granting the snowballing buff Soul Eater, just a ridiculously strong amulet. But it unfortunately makes equipping our items and gems much more difficult. Once you have a solid amulet, look to anoint it with one of these. Early on, when you're still pathing directly to Primal Manifestation, you'll likely want to anoint the affordable Ironwood, or consider one of these compelling alternatives. When you eventually switch to a double cluster setup, swap over to Primal Manifestation. Our rings will likely begin as 2 affordable Kikazarus. Once you've secured Viridi's Veil, both Kikazarus can be dropped. In the left ring slot, run an Essence Worm containing the Aura Zealotry, so it won't reserve any mana. In the right ring slot, we need to run a Magic Rarity ring. Because this ring will only have 2 modifiers, you'll almost certainly be looking for a high roll of life alongside a suffix you want, likely a high resistance roll. Ultimately, this ring can be crafted yourself, using just alterations and augmentations. Our belt will likely begin as a flexible rare, focused on just life and resistances. Many players may want to quickly upgrade to a cheap Arn's Anguish, which converts our 4 minimum endurance charges to minimum brutal charges, sacrificing the defensive power of the endurance charges in order to effectively gain a 12% chance to deal triple damage, a massive and affordable damage increase. Eventually, if you can accumulate a ton of currency, you can swap over to the expensive Coward's Legacy, which you can combine with my alternative Pain Attunement skill trees. Coward's Legacy in practice is even stronger than Arn's Anguish and allows you to keep your endurance charges. It's worth upgrading to eventually, but because it's so expensive, I recommend waiting until you've at least finished up your cluster jewels. And with that, we've arrived at the Flasks, which received a ton of changes this league, losing a lot of their power. They're also expected to face even more changes next league. All of this makes it tough to recommend anything super directly. Try to secure as many of these immunities as you feel you need. Freeze and Bleed are the most important, but everything can be dangerous in the right circumstances. Your selected immunities can be rolled onto any of these flasks. I heavily recommend running a life flask, ideally one with instant recovery. You can also run a mana flask if you'd like, one that either features instant recovery or the recently nerfed enduring. In addition to these options, here are some uniques worth consideration. Dying Sun provides 2 additional projectiles, an incredibly strong modifier that may slightly improve clear speed, but will only benefit your single target damage against large bosses. Rumi's Concoction is still very strong defensively, and should be heavily considered. The Overflowing Chalice provides all the benefits of a Sulfur Flask, while heavily increasing the amount of charges your other flasks gain. Blood of the Karawi and Lasagna's Spirit are extremely effective life and mana flasks. If you feel you have enough immunities, consider swapping one of these in. Finally, if you've got a ton of currency, Bottled Faith is still really good and should absolutely be run. On top of all of this, Instilling and Enkindling Orbs now exist. Enkindling Orbs provide a powerful enchantment, but make the flask less reliable. Instilling Orbs allow you to automatically trigger a flask when a certain condition is met, and can even be crafted directly. Whether and how you choose to use these is completely up to you. I truly recommend doing your own testing to see what works best for you. And with that, I've covered just about everything. I hope that you enjoyed the guide. A massive thank you to everyone who's continued to support the channel. I'm sure some of you are wondering where the videos have been this last year. My goal has always been to make each video better than the last. While this hopefully has resulted in some really good videos, there simply haven't been enough of them. At this point, actions are going to speak a lot louder than words. Expect to see the gap between videos get shorter with every release, so consider sticking around, liking the video, and subbing to the channel if you want to see more in the future. A huge thank you to all of my patrons for your incredible understanding and support. You guys have continued to make this content possible to produce. Some special recognition goes to Adam Benamias, Agent Leo, Andrew Miller, Bacon Overlord, Bloody, Chris IRL, Christopher Cravey, Damian Jagnondan, Dan Wayne, Evan Jones, Gareth Thomas, Garth Anderson, Glenn G, Greg Wells, Hunter Wild, Ichiro Nimi, Jacob Davey, John Gabriel, Kurt Wood, Lame Dog, Lukash Galik, Lazy Burns, Mockmeal, Matthias Frank Grunkavist, Michael Johnson, Modimus Prime, Piotr, Rasmus Blokpelsko, Ravager Nick, Ray Hill, Sabaton Babylon, Spencer Wright, Tony G773, Varos Batele, Xi, Zurashi, and finally Sven. An additional thank you to Modimus Prime. If you'd like to support the channel, receive a credit, or join our Discord, consider checking out the Patreon link below. And as always, I've been Esoro, and I will see you guys in the next one.